morning, everyone. Are you ready to have a good time today and hear some stories? Yes. Well, I'll tell you what, you're going to be in for a treat this morning because this gentleman is a character. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Bill Harley. He's from Seacont, Massachusetts, and all I can tell you is it's a town of about 12,000 population south of Boston and almost to the Rhode Island border. His early love was for baseball and wanted to become a second baseman for the Cincinnati Reds, as Carl related to last night. Now, I got a personal comment to make in regards to your baseball desires. I wish your age was a little younger, and instead of being a second baseman, you wanted to be a relief pitcher, because the Kansas City Royals could sure use you. Anyway, Bill began his singing and storytelling in 1975 while in college. He is a prolific author and recording artist and tours nationwide as an author, performing artist and keynote speaker, and is a two-time Grammy Award winner. His stories are filled with details of daily life. Please help me in welcoming Bill Harley.
Thank you, thank you. Well, I've lived in New England a long time, so after about 10 or 15 years living there, I just gave up and became a Red Sox fan. Kind of living large right now, you know. So the story I'm actually going to tell you today is really different from a lot of the work that I do. A lot of my work's original. If you've seen me, you know that. But I think storytellers are given a couple stories over their life that aren't theirs, but that they carry with them. One of them, maybe I'll tell later, is from my favorite stories is called The Happy Man's Shirt. I learned it from Duncan Williamson, a traditional Scottish teller. But this is a story I fell in love with many years ago. I started to read about John Muir, and I really fell in love with who he was and what he had tried to do and the way he looked at the world. And a friend of mine from California, when I was telling him that, he said, "Well, do you know Stikine?" And I said, "No, I don't know it." And he went into his bookshelf and he gave me this book, and I read it over and over again, and I read it to my sons when they were growing up, and I just kind of carried it with me. And about 15 years ago, I tried to start to learn it, and I did it for a year or so, put it down, but I've picked it up in the past year. And I think I'm ready to tell it now. So I want to put this all in a little bit of context. I want to tell you a little bit about John Muir in order to understand what happened in the story. So John Muir was born in Dunbar, Scotland. It's on the east coast of Scotland in 1838. And his father was a very strict Presbyterian. As a matter of fact, he was so strict and harsh that the Campbellites kicked him out. He was hard on his children, on his two sons. We would call it abusive today. And when John was about 9 or 10 years old, they moved to the United States. His father insisted on bringing the cast iron stove with them from Scotland because he wasn't sure if they'd have one. And they moved to Wisconsin. And so he grew up on a farm in Wisconsin and went to University of Wisconsin early on. When it had just formed. And even then, people knew John was brilliant, but he was very unsettled. And he was in and out. He wandered the country trying to figure out who he was, and what he wanted to do. And when he was in his late 20s, he went to the Sierra Nevadas, and I think one of the great American books is My First Summer in the Sierras. It's a beautiful book, and there it seemed that John had some kind of religious experience up there. He makes reference to it in that book. And John's God was very different from his father's God. John's God, or Johnny, as his friends called him, seemed to see the Spirit of God in everything that lived and breathed. And he loved nature. and he was the founder of the Sierra Club. He fought for the establishment of Yosemite Valley. Yosemite Valley was his to become a national park. And for 40 or 50 years, he was a spokesman for wilderness and trying to make us look at what our relationship is with the rest of the world. He wrote, "A man believes that the God made the world for him, a belief that is unsupported by any facts." So that's kind of a background for this story. And this story actually became, for him, a way of talking about that our relationship with other creatures living things on the planet need to be re-examined. So the story I'm going to tell you is about something that happened to him on a glacier in 1880 in Alaska. And the notes about the story that he took the next day, he makes no mention of the dog Stikine. He just talks about the horrible time he had on the glacier. But John was an incredible after-dinner speaker. People loved to have him come over to the house, and he would tell stories afterwards. He wasn't a great public speaker, but over the dinner table. And he would show up, and after dinner, people would say, "John, tell us the story about the dog." And he'd say, "What do you mean?" He said, "You know, the story on the glacier." And after he told this, and he told this hundreds of times before he wrote it down, he realized that the story was about the dog and not about himself, which happens to storytellers all the time. We think it's about us, but that's not who it's about. And so he told the story, and finally he wrote it down. And when I looked at the story, I loved the story, and I looked at his language, and I realized that I really needed to tell it in his words. I can tell you about the story in my words, but I wanted to tell it in his words because, first of all, they're really beautiful. And the second thing is that they say that when John told the story, the more animated it became, the more his mother tongue came out, and he would start to impart this Scottish burr when he got really excited. So I looked at this for a long time, and it felt like I could hear it in that language. And John was also, because of his father, he knew the Bible back and front, and so he had the kind of King James language in his vocabulary. So I decided I was going to tell it. I've worked a little bit on the Scottish burr, so if some of you are familiar with it, I'd like to apologize for my accent, although I'm kind of passing the couple people who come up to me who are Scottish or from the British Isles and said, "You did a pretty good job." I think that's probably enough right now. In the summer of 1880, I set out from Fort Wrangell in a canoe to continue my explorations of the icy region of southeast Alaska. I started in the fall of 1879. When the provisions were stowed and the Indian crew was ready, my companion, the Reverend S.H. Young, came aboard, and he was followed by a little black dog who immediately made himself at home by curling up in a hollow among the baggage. Now, I like dogs, but this one seemed so small and worthless, I objected to his going, and I asked the missionary why he was taking him. I said, "This trip's not good for toy dogs. We'll be in the rain and the cold for weeks and months. He'll require the care of a baby. Pass him up to the boys on the wharf to play with the children." "But no," said the Reverend Young. He assured me he was a perfect wonder of a dog. Could endure cold and hunger like a bear, swim like a seal, was wondrous and wise and cunning. He made out a list of virtues to show he might be the most interesting member of our trip. No one could hope to unravel the lines of his ancestry. In all the wonderful mixed and varied tribe, I never saw another creature quite like him, though in his soft, sly gliding motions, he sometimes reminded me of a fox. He was short-legged and bunch-bodied. His hair, though long and smooth, was slightly wavy, so when the wind was at his back, it ruffled and made him look fluffy. At first sight, the only noticeable feature about him was his fine tail, about as airy and shady as a squirrel's, carried curling forward almost to his nose. Mr. Young told me when the little fellow was a young pup, about the size of a wood rat.
He was given to his wife by an Irish prospector in Sitka. And on their arrival in Fort Wrangel, he was adopted with enthusiasm by the Stikine Indians, named Stikine for their tribe, and became a universal favorite. Petted, protected, admired wherever he went, considered a mysterious fountain of wisdom. On our own trip, he soon proved himself a queer character, odd, concealed, independent, invincibly quiet, and do many things which piqued my curiosity. For instance, as we sailed day after day through the narrow, intricate inlets and channels among the islands, the mountains of the coast, he spent most of the sluggish day in sluggish ease, apparently as unobserving as if in deep sleep. But we soon found that he always seemed to know what was going on. For when something on the shore excited our attention, or the Indians were about to shoot at ducks or seals, he'd raise his head, rested on the edge of the canoe, and gaze out like a dreamy-eyed tourist. And when he heard us talking about making a place to land, he'd rouse himself, ready to see what sort of place we were coming to, ready to jump overboard as soon as the canoe neared the beach. Then, with a vigorous shake to get rid of the brine and the hair, he'd run off in the woods to hunt. But although he was always the first out of the canoe, he was always the last in. When we were ready to go, he could never be found. Stikine never came to our call. We soon discovered, though, we could not see him. He could see us. And from the covers of the briars and the huckleberry bushes on the fringes of the forest, he was watching the canoe with wary eye. For as soon as we were fairly off, he came trotting down the beach, plunged into the water, and swam after us, knowing full well we would cease our own to take him in. When the contrary little vagabond came alongside, he was lifted by the neck, held out a moment to drip, and dropped into the canoe. We tried to cure him of this habit by compelling him to swim long distances, as if we had a mind to abandon him. But this did no good. The longer the swim, the more he seemed to like it. The days we camped early, the best hunter went off into the woods for a deer, and Stikine was sure to be at his heels, provided I had not gone out before. For strange to say, though I never carried a gun, he insisted on following me, forsaking the hunter and even his master to share in my wanderings, however wild the weather, gliding like a fox through the thorny tangles of panax and rubus, barely stirring a rain-laden leaf, wading and wallowing through snow, swimming icy streams, skipping over boulders and logs in the crevasses of glaciers with the patience and the endurance of a mountaineer, never tiring or getting discouraged. Once he followed me over the surface of a glacier which was so rough that it cut his feet until every step was marked with blood, but he trotted on with Indian fortitude until I noticed his red trail, and taking pity upon him, I made little moccasins out of a handkerchief. No matter his troubles, never would he ask for help or make complaint, as if he had discovered, like a philosopher, that without hard work and suffering there can be no pleasure worth having. But none of us could make out what Stikine was any good for. Never answered our calls, insisted on having his way. The hunter could never set him on anything he'd shot or make him check the birds. He was so even-tempered, he seemed to have no feeling. Ordinary storms were a pleasure to him, as if from mere rain, he flourished in it like a vegetable. No matter what advances you'd make, scarce a glance or a tail wag would you get for your effort. But though he was about as cold as a glacier and as impervious to fun, I tried hard to make his acquaintance, guessing there must be something worthwhile beneath so much courage and endurance and love of wild, weathery adventure. No superannuated bulldog or mastiff had more stoic dignity than this fluffy midget. He sometimes reminded me of a small, squat, unshakable desert cactus. For he never showed a trace of the merry, tricksy, elfish fun of the terriers and collies we know, nor of their touching affection or devotion. Like children, most small dogs ask only to be loved and allowed to love in return. But Stikine, he seemed like Diogenes, asking only to be left alone. holding the true tenor of his hidden life with the silence and serenity of nature. His true strength of character lay in his eyes, for they're as old as the hills, and as wise and as young. I never tired of looking into them. I've often looked into the faces of animals and plants, and I stared keenly at this little sphinx, for there's no estimating the wit and wisdom concealed and latent in our lower fellow mortals until made manifest by profound experience. After we'd sailed for weeks, up the channel, through the Sundom and the Taku fjords, across Glacier Bay, we at last came to the mouth of an inlet known today as Taylor's Bay. And we reached the head of it about 5 o'clock, where we made a camp in a grove of spruce trees at the foot of a large glacier. While camp was being made, Mr. Young and I went off for a closer look at the glacier. We found it was separated from the waters of the inlet by a tide-washed moraine and extended all the way across from wall to wall of the inlet, a distance of about 3 miles. On the way back, I planned a far and wide excursion for the morrow. I woke early, not on account of the glacier, which had been on my mind all night, but a grand flood storm. The rain was flying with the wind in a passionate horizontal flood as it was just passing over the country instead of falling off it. The main perennial streams were booming high above the banks, joined by scores of new and pouring over the lofty gray walls of the inlet with cascades and falls. I had intended having a cup of coffee and something like breakfast before setting out, but when I heard the storm and looked out on it, I made haste to join it, for many of nature's finest lessons can be learned in her storms. If carefully keeping right relations with them, one may go safely abroad, rejoicing in the wonder of their works and ways, chanting with the Norsemen, "The blast of the tempest day is our oars, the hurricane is our servant, and takes us whither we wish to go." So, for the sake of my breakfast, I put a piece of bread in my pocket and set out. Stickeen was still in the tent with the Indians and Mr. Young, and I hoped he would stay there, but I had not gone more than a dozen rods. Then he left his warm place in the tent and came boring through the blast after me. That a man should welcome storms for their exhilarating music and motion and go forth to see God-making landscapes is reasonable enough. But what fascination could such tremendous weather hold for a dog? Surely nothing akin to the human enthusiasm for geology or scenery. But anyhow, he came on through the choking blast. I stopped, tried to make him turn back, offering good advice. He says, "No, Stickeen, what's gotten you a queer noodle now? You must be daft. This wild day's nothing for you. There's no game aboard, only weather. Go back to your camp, have breakfast with your master, be sensible for enough. I have no food, I can't carry all day. This wild weather will kill you." But nature, it seems, was at the bottom of the matter. Gains her ways with dogs as well as men, making us do as she likes, shoving us, pulling us along her way, however roughly, all but killing us at times, and getting her lessons driven hard down. So at last, after stopping again and again, I saw he would not be shaken, as well as the earth might try to shake off the moon. Pitiful little wanderer just stood there drenched and blinking, saying, "Whither thou goest, I will go." So at last I said to him, "Come on if you must." I gave him a piece of bread from my pocket, and we struggled on together. And so began the most memorable of all my wild days. The level flood driving hard in our faces thrashed and washed us until we got in the shelter of a grove on the east side of the glacier, where we stopped for a while to catch our breath and look out. The exploration of the glacier was my main object, but at that point the wind was too high to allow excursions over the open surface, where one might be dangerously shoved or balancing for a jump at the brink of a crevasse. But in the meantime, the storm made a fine study. Here, the glacier descends an abrupt swell of resisting rock 500 feet high and leaned forward, falling in great ice cascades. With the storm coming down from the north, Stickeen and I were beneath the main current of the blast, but favorably located to see and hear it. What a psalm the storm was singing. How fresh the smell of the washed earth and leaves There was music in the leaves and the branches and the furrowed bowls, and even the ice spires and crags overhead. Many of the tones soft and low, as if each leaf and tree, crag and spire were a tuned reed. There was a broad torrent draining the side of the glacier. It was rolling boulders along its rocky channel, making thudding, bumping, muffled sounds, rushing with tremendous energy as if in haste to get out of the mountains, the water above calling to the water below, and all to the ocean, their home. So, when the wind began to abate, I traced the east side of the glacier, and about 3 miles from its front, I climbed to its surface by means of ice steps to make it easy for Stikine. I looked out on the glacier. It stretched away as far as I could see beneath the gray sky, seemingly boundless prairie of ice. The rain continued to fall and grew colder, which I did not mind, but a dim, snowy look in the clouds made me hesitate about venturing farther from the shore in case the clouds should settle and give snow, or the wind become more violent. Snow crystals, those flowers of the mountain clouds, are frail and beautiful things, but horrible when flying in dark and benumbing swarms, or welded into the glaciers filled with deadly crevasses. Watching the sky, I sauntered about on the crystal sea, and for a mile or so out, the ice seemed remarkably safe. The marginal crevasses were mostly narrow. The wider ones we easily passed around either side, and the weather seemed to open here and there. At last, thus encouraged, I set out for the other side, for nature will make us do anything she likes. At first I made good speed and the sky was not threatening. I took bearings occasionally with my compass to help me find my way back through the storm in case the wind should become more violent, but the structure lines of the ice were my main guides. Towards the western side, we came to a closely crevassed section in which I had to make many long and narrow tacks and doublings, tracing the edges of tremendous transverse and longitudinal crevasses, perhaps 25 feet wide, 1,000 feet deep, beautiful and awful. In working my way through these, I was severely cautious, but Stikine came on as unhesitating as the flying clouds. The widest crevasse I dare jump, he would fly across without so much looking at. The weather was making quick changes now, scattering bits of dazzling brightness amid the wintry gloom. And at rare intervals, the sun broke forth wholly free, and the glacier could be seen from shore to shore, with a bright array of encompassing mountains partly revealed, wearing the clouds as garment, while the prairie bloomed and sparkled with the iris light of myriad washed crystals. And then just as suddenly, the whole scene would be darkened and blotted out. Stikine cared for none of these things, bright nor dark. There were the wells, the moulins, the swiftly flowing streams, the crevasses into which he might fell. The little traveler was only about 2 years old, but nothing seemed novel to him, nothing daunted him. He showed neither caution nor curiosity, but bravely trotted on as if the glacier was a playground. His stout, muffled body was all one skipping muscle. It was truly wonderful to see how quickly and apparent heedlessly he flashed across these nerve-trying chasms, 6 or 8 feet wide, hundreds of feet deep. His courage was so unwavering, it seemed to be due to dullness of perception, as if he was just blindly, stupidly bold. And I kept telling him to be careful, for we had been companions on so many wilderness adventures. I'd formed the habit of speaking to him as I would to a small boy, and he understood every word. Here, boy, this way. No, over here. Right, good boy, good boy. We reached the west shore of the glacier in about 3 hours. The width of the glacier being about 7 miles. Then I pushed up the glacier, northward, in order to see as far back into the fountain of the glacier in the Fairweather Range, in case the clouds should lift. Walking here on the edge of the forest was easy. The forest had been invaded and crushed by the ice. In an hour or so after passing a massive headland, we came upon a branch of the glacier in the form of a magnificent ice cascade about 2 miles wide, pouring over the main basin of the glacier in a westerly direction, its surface broken by wave-shaped blades, shattered ice blocks, suggesting the wildest updashing, heaving, plunging motion of a great river cataract. Filing it down about 2 or 3 miles, we found it emptying to a lake filling with icebergs. I would gladly have followed the lake outlet down to tide water, but the day was already far spent, and the threatening sky called for haste in getting off the ice before dark. I therefore decided to go no further, and after taking another general view of the wonderful region, I turned back, hoping to see it again under more favorable auspices. Well, I hope so. I'm going to stop here and talk a little bit about what just happened and explain a little bit about glaciers. So, no one could keep up with Muir when he hiked. The books he wrote about day hikes in the Sierras are totally useless because they're like 35-mile hikes. So there was a half mile to the glacier, and then he walked 3 miles along its side, and he climbed to the surface. He walked across, which is 7 miles. Then he walked for another hour, 3 miles, so we're at 13, and then he walked down 3 or 4 miles. So by the time he turned back, he had already walked 17 miles on a glacier. 34 miles in a day on ice. And I want to explain something about glaciers here. Although we're losing them, I want to talk about them now. So it helps if we think of a glacier as a river of ice. That's really what it is. So the snow falls up in the mountains, it compacts and compacts, and it becomes so heavy, and there's such a buildup, it begins to work its way down the mountains to the sea. And of course, because of the force of ice, it crushes everything in its path. Now, a glacier is like a river, too, in the sense that different parts of the glacier travel at different speeds. Like the main current of the river is going to go faster than the eddies, something on either side, or when you go around a bend, something's faster as it finds its way down. So it's only natural parts of the river, of the ice, move faster than others. And when that happens, finally there's a crack in between those two things, like the currents. And then it melts, and it rains, and it freezes, and as that happens, the crack between them widens and widens and widens and grows deeper and deeper and deeper. Those are crevasses. That's how crevasses are formed as they're worn. Now sometimes if you think of like a piece of wood, when it's partly cut and trying to split it, there's these little tendons between the two pieces of wood. And you kind of push one forward, and there's a little slant. So those are ice bridges. And as the ice moves, those are stretched and they become diagonal. And as the weather wears on them, they melt and freeze and melt and freeze. The center part is the one that gets the most weather. So it's only natural that the center part of the bridge begins to wear down. So we have that kind of classic look of an ice bridge across a crevasse going like this. I want to make sure you understand that. The other thing about Muir right now is he's 42 years old. He got married a year ago. And he was running his father-in-law's farm in Martinez, California. He was a very successful farmer, but he was unhappy because he wasn't in the wilderness. And his wife became pregnant, and his friend asked him if he wanted to go to Alaska. And his wife said, "Johnny, you better go. This is your last chance." And so he left, wondering what was going to become of his life. At this point, no one knew who he was. He hadn't written anything. He's 40 years old, 42 years old. So you can almost look at this as like the midlife crisis of his life. It's the point when everything turned. At first, we made good speed up the canyon of the ice torrent and out onto the main glacier. We left the west shore about 2 miles behind. We came to a difficult network of crevasses, and then the clouds began to drop their misty fringes. And soon, the dreaded snow came flying thick and fast. I now became anxious about finding my way through the storm. Stikine was still the same silent, able little hero. I noticed, though, after the storm darkness came on, he kept close behind me. The snow urged us to make haste, but at the same time hit our way. I pushed on as best I could, jumping innumerable crevasses, and for every mile or so of direct advance, or 100 rods or so of direct advance, traveling a mile or two up and down in the turmoil of the chasms as the dislocated ice blocks. In an hour or so, we came to a series of immense crevasses, appalling in width, straight and regular in trend, like immense furrows. These I traced with firm nerve, poising cautiously at their edges after cutting hollows from my feet before making the leap to guard against any uncertainty on the farther side, where only one trial was granted. It's an exercise both frightful and inspiring. Stikeen followed, making nothing of it. We ran ahead. Many a mile we ran. Running now instead of walking, as the danger of having to spend the night on the glacier was threatening. Doubtless I could have weathered the storm for dancing on a flat spot to keep from freezing. We were wet and hungry, and the wind down from the north, bitterly cold and filled with snow, so of course that night would have seemed a long one. I couldn't see far enough ahead to see in which general direction the least dangerous route lay, while the few dim momentary glimpses I caught of the mountains through the rifts in the flying clouds were far from reassuring, either as weather signs or guides. I could only grope my way from crevasse to crevasse, holding to a general direction by the ice structure, which is not always to be seen, and the wind. Again and again, I was put to my mettle. But Stikeen came on as unhesitating and the flying clouds, running, jumping, holding every moment of daylight, poor as it was, precious. We doggedly persevered, hoping every obstacle we overcame would be the last of its kind. But on the contrary, they became more deadly trying. At last, our way was blocked by a very wide and straight crevasse, which I traced northward for a mile or so without finding a crossing or any hope of any, and down the other end its side, where it joined another uncrossable crevasse. In all this distance of perhaps 2 miles, there was only one place I might cross, but here the jump seemed dangerously wide. Furthermore, the side it was on was a foot or two above the other side, and even with this advantage, the jump seemed too much to make. One is liable to underestimate the width of crevasses where the magnitude is great. I therefore stared at this one keenly, estimating its width and the shape of the ice on the other side, until I thought I might cross it if I had to. But in case I had to jump back from the other side, I might fail. Now, no cautious mountaineer takes a step on unknown ground that he cannot retrace in case of unseen obstacles ahead. This is the rule of mountaineers who live long. Though in great haste, I made myself to sit down and calmly deliberate before I broke it. Retracing my path in my imagination, as if on a chart, I saw that I was now recrossing glacier a mile or two above the course I pursued in the morning, and it was a section I had not before seen. Should I risk this jump, or instead try to make it back to the other side before dark, build a fire, and have only hunger to endure while waiting for a new day? I saw that I had already crossed such a broad expanse of dangerous ice, it would be difficult for me to get back across the ice in the storm before dark. Well, just ahead, the surface seemed more promising, and the east side was now about as close as the west. I was therefore eager to go on, but this wide jump seemed a dangerous obstacle. At last, because of the dangers already encountered, I decided to venture against those that might be ahead, and I jumped and landed well. But with so little left to spell, I now feared being compelled to jump back from the lower side. Stikeen followed, making nothing of it. We ran ahead, hoping we were leaving all our troubles behind, but when the distance of 200 yards, our way was blocked by the very widest crevasse yet encountered. Of course, I made haste to explore it. About 3/4 of a mile upstream, I found and joined the crevasse we had just crossed, as I feared it would, and tracing it down at the other end also, it joined it at that end too, maintaining through its whole distance a width of about 50 feet. I therefore discovered, to my dismay, I was on a narrow island of ice, 2 miles long, with only 2 barely possible ways of escape. One, back by the way we had come, and another, across an almost inaccessible sliver bridge of ice that crossed the crevasse near the middle of it. So after this nerve-trying discovery, I ran back to Muir, cautiously examine it. This sliver of bridge was evidently very old, for it was as weathered and wasted as any that had ever lain in my way. Here the width of the glacier was the crevasse was about 50 feet, and the ice bridge crossing it diagonally was about 70 feet long. Its knife-thin edge at the center was depressed 25 or 30 feet below the surface of the glacier, and its upcurving ends attached to the side of the crevasse 8 or 10 feet below the surface of the glacier. Getting down those nearly vertical wall to the bridge and up the other side were the main obstacles, and it seemed all but insurmountable. Of the many perils I'd faced in all my years on the mountains and glaciers, none seemed so plain or stern or merciless as this. And it was presented when we are wet to the bone, hungry, the wind filled with bitter, cold, driving snow, and nighttime coming on. But we were forced to face it. Beginning not immediately above the bridge, but slightly to one side, I cut a hollow for my knees, right on the brink. And then leaning forward over the edge with my short-handled axe, I cut a step 16 or 18 inches below the surface of the glacier, which on account of the sheerness of the wall was necessarily shallow. This step, however, was well made and sloped inward and formed a good hold for my heels. Then, slipping cautiously upon it, with my left side to the wall, I steadied myself with my left hand in a notch. With my right, I cut a series of steps and notches in succession, guarding against losing balance by the glinting of the axe or the gust of the wind. For life and death lay in every stroke and the neatness and finish of every foothold. On gaining the bridge, I cut a small level platform on it, about 6 or 8 inches wide. And it was a trying thing to balance on a slippery platform while getting safely astride the sliver. Crossing was then relatively easy. With short, careful strokes, I knocked off the knife-thin edge. My knees pressed to the side to keep my balance. I hitched myself forward an inch or two at a time. I studiously ignored the tremendous abyss on either side. To me, the whole world was that thin blue sliver. But the most trying part of the adventure, after crossing inch by inch and chipping another level platform, was to rise from my safe position on the bridge and cut a ladder into the vertical face of the wall, chipping, climbing, holding on with my feet and fingers in mere notches. At such times, one whole body becomes I, and common skill and fortitude are replaced with a power beyond our knowledge. Never before had I been so long under deadly strain. How I got up that I can never tell. The thing seemed to have been done by someone else. I've never held death in contempt. I've often felt to meet one's fate on a mountain or the heart of a glacier would be blessed as compared to death from some disease or some shabby lowland accident. But the best death, so quick and pure, set so openly before us, is hard to face, even though we are sure we've had enough happiness for a dozen lives. But little Stikeen, poor, wee, hairy, sleekit beastie, What of him? When I had decided to dare the bridge, I was down on my knees above the brink. He came up behind me. He pushed his head past my shoulder, looked down and across, scanning the bridge and its approaches, and looked in my face in a startled air of surprise and concern, began to mutter and whine, saying as surely speaking with words, "Surely you're not going down in that horrible place." It's the first time he'd ever looked into a glacier or my face with an eager, speaking, troubled look. That he should have recognized and appreciated the danger at one glance showed wonderful sagacity. Never before had the daring little midget seemed to know that ice was slippery or there was anything such as danger anywhere. His looks and tones of voice, when he began to complain and speak his mind, were so perfectly human. I unconsciously spoke to him as I would to a small boy, and perhaps in trying to calm his fears, I moderated my own. "Hush now," I said, "little boy. We'll get across. It will not be easy. No right way is safe in this rough world. We must risk our lives to save them. At worst, we can only slip, and then what a grand grave we will have, and by our bones will do good in the terminal moraine." But my sermon was far from reassuring him. And after another desperate look at the tremendous gulf, he ran off in desperate excitement, looking for some other way around. When he returned, baffled, of course, I had made a step or two, and I dared not look back, but he made himself heard. And when he saw that I was bent on crossing, he cried aloud, as if in the bitterness of death. Could this be the silent, philosophic Stikeen? When I reached the other side, he screamed louder than ever, "No, no, no!" I called to him. The bridge was not as bad as it looked. He could come if he'd only try. But he was afraid to try. He stopped and looked and then shouted out his unshakable conviction that he could never go down there. If the danger had been less, his distress would have seemed ridiculous. But here in this desperate gulf lay the shadow of death, and his heart-rending cries might as well call to heaven. Perhaps they did. So hidden before, he was now perfectly transparent. One could see the workings of his mind and heart like the movements of a clock out of its case. I was troubled at the thought of leaving him behind him, not being able to find him in the morning. But it seemed impossible to make him to come. I said, "You can come if you want to come." He'd push for a moment. He'd look out and then shout out his unshakable conviction. He'd never go down there. His natural composure and calm had vanished utterly in a tumultuous storm of fear. It was impossible to make him come. To compel him to come through fear of being banded, I disappeared behind a hummock, but this did no good. He only lay down and moaned and screamed in utter hopeless misery. So at last I returned to the brink of the crevasse and I said, "Stikeen, I can wait no longer for you. If you can't come back, I only promise I'll come back in the morning. If you go back to the woods, the wolves will kill you. Stikeen, come. You must come now. Come." He understood very well what I meant. At last, with the courage born of despair, hushed and breathless, he crouched down low in the hollow I'd made for my knees, pressing his body into the ice as if trying to get the advantage of the friction of every hair. He gazed down in the first step, and then slowly, slowly, he slid his feet over the edge into that first step until all 4 feet were in it and he was practically standing on his head. Then, as near as I could see through the storm and the snow, without lifting his feet, he slipped them into the next and the next and the next and the next until he gained the bridge. Then, with the slowness and the regularity of the vibrations of a second's pendulum, holding himself steady against the wind, giving separate attention to each step, as if counting, measuring 1, 2, 3, 4, he gained the edge of the bridge. Well, I was down on my knees above it to reach down and get him if she'd get close. But here he paused in deathly silence. And here I thought he might fail, for dogs are poor climbers. I had no cord. If I did, I would have made a noose to haul him up. But while I was wondering whether a cord might mean me out of some clothing, he was gazing intently at all the steps and notches I had made, as if fixing and measuring the position of each of them in his mind. And then suddenly, up he came in a springy rush, hooking his paws in each step and notch so quickly I couldn't see how it was done. He flashed by my shoulder, safe at last. Now came a scene. Never before had I seen such a passionate revulsion from the depths of despair to utter uncontrollable joy. I tried to catch him, but he would not be caught. He flashed and darted. Good little boy, I say, hither and thither, lying down and rolling over, turning around in great giddy leaps, like a leaf in a whirlwind, lying down, rolling over, pouring forth a tumultuous flood of sobs and cries and gasping mutterings. When I tried to catch him for fearing my die of such excitement, he flashed off, his feet a mist of motion, 200-300 yards, then stopped suddenly, came back at me, practically knocked me over, lying down, rolling over, feet in the air, screaming and shouting as if saying, "Save, save, 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 save." Moses' stately song of escape from the Egyptians in the Red Sea was nothing compared to it. Who would have guessed the capacity of this dull, endurant little fellow for all that most stirs the mortal frame? None could have helped but cry with him. But there's nothing like hard work to tone down excessive joy and fear. And I ran ahead and said, "Stop your foolishness, we still have far to go." Neither of us feared another trial like that. Heaven would surely count one enough for lifetime. The ice was gashed with thousands of crevasses, but they were all common ones. We ran without fatigue, each muscle with immense rebounding glory in its strength. Stikine flew across everything in its path, and it wasn't until darkness came on that he settled into his normal fox-like trot. And then the mountains came into the view, and we felt solid rock beneath our feet, and we were safe. The danger was gone, and with it our strength. We tottered down the lateral moraine, through the Devil Club thicket of the shelter that had sheltered us that afternoon, back across the terminal moraine, and we reached camp about 10 o'clock, where we found a big fire and a big dinner. A party of Hoon Indians had brought Mr. Young some fresh strawberries and wild salmon, but we fell into our beds too tired to eat much. The man who said, "The greater the toil, the sweeter the rest," was never profoundly tired. For Stikine kept jumping up at night, twitching, muttering, and whining, no doubt still at the edge of that crevasse in his dreams, as did I that night and many nights after. Thereafter, for the rest of the trip, Stikine was a changed dog. Instead of keeping himself aloof, he always tried to be at my side, tried to keep me in sight at all times, would barely accept a morsel of food from any hand but mine. At night, when all was quiet around the campfire, he'd come up, he'd rest his head in my lap and look up at me like we're a god. Sometimes he'd look at me as if he was trying to say, "Remember that horrible time we had on the glacier?" Nothing in the after years has dimmed my memory of that Alaska storm day, and it all comes rushing and roaring back to mind. If I'm still in the heart of it, I see the glacier crushing the mountains. I see those clouds with the riding with the snow and the rain. I see that magnificent ice cascade beneath the white fountains of the Fairweather Range, and in the heart of it, I see that horrible crevasse, the emblem of the Valley of Death. And I see the clouds flying over it, and the snow falling in it, and on its edge I see little Stikine, and I hear his cries of help and his shouts of joy. Many dogs have I known, and many stories I could tell you of their wisdom and devotion, but none do I owe as much as to Stikine. so least known, so hidden at first, he became suddenly the best known. And through him, as through a window, I have ever looked with greater sympathy upon our fellow mortals. Can they not feel as we feel? None of his friends know what became of Stikine. After my studies were done for the season, I returned to California, and I never saw him again. In reply to anxious inquiry, Mr. Young wrote me that in the summer of 1882, he was stolen by tourists in Fort Wrangell and taken away on a steamer, never seen again. His fate is shrouded in mystery. Doubtless he has left this world, crossed the last crevasse, and gone on to the next. But to me, Stikine will never be forgotten. To me, and I hope to you, Stikine is immortal. Stikine, come! You must come! Come! Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Thanks. So I do have a recording of that. I should say when he first wrote this story and he wanted to get it published, he was actually more outspoken about our relationship with other creatures and saying that there really is no difference between humans and other living things. And the magazine, The Century, which was like the magazine at the time, the editor said, we can't say that. People will kill us if we say that humans and animals are the same. But it was something that Muir carried with him his whole life. So there's just a little hint of that. Thanks for listening. I appreciate you being such a good audience. I'm used to having people laugh, so it's really nerve-wracking for me to be quiet all this time, but I guess the story deserves it. Thanks a lot. Take care. I'll see y'all later.
Wow. I challenge any of you to repeat what Bill just got through saying. Anyway, thanks for coming. Let's give him one more round of applause. Bill, thank you very much. All right, the next program on docket here at Memorial Hall is at 11 o'clock, and it's the Legends. Good morning. Are you all having a good time so far? Good. It's my pleasure to introduce to you this morning the legends who will bring our local Kansas history to life and tell you about history being made even right here and around Osborne County. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the legends. Let's welcome them with a round of applause.
Woo, boy, howdy. I just flew in. And boy, like literally flew in, didn't I? Oh, well, I am very excited to be here. My name is Marie Engelmann, and I just flew in from Hill City, Kansas. Now, I'm not originally from Hill City. I'm actually from Kentucky originally. I was born in Kentucky in 1918. And I have to tell you, Kentucky's a lot different than Kansas is. It's about all I can say. I grew up in Kentucky up until I was 7 years old. I lived with my mother and my father and my brother. Now, about the time I was 7, my mother and father decided to divorce, and they decided that it'd be a good idea if my brother stayed with my mother, and I was to travel with my father and his mother, my grandmother, and travel to the middle of nowhere. So, needless to say, when I first pulled into Kansas and I pulled into Hill City on the train, I was not very happy. I looked around and I saw that there were no trees in Kansas. Now, I know that you may think that these are trees. These are not trees. These are bushes. It blew my mind. I couldn't believe there weren't any trees. There were no blackberries. There were no hazelnuts. There were no pecans, no almonds. And the dirt, I'm sorry, but I don't know where in the world you can go and you can find red dirt but in Kansas. Never seen that in my life. Dirt is supposed to be brown. Now, to give you a little bit of an example of how difficult it was for me when I moved to Kansas, I want to tell you a little tiny story about when I was a little girl. You see, I grew up on a tobacco plantation in Kentucky. We lived in a grand house, and we had workers who lived in other houses. Now, slavery had been abolished by this time, but the workers still did not get paid money. They were instead paid in kind. There were very strict rules in Kentucky. I was not allowed to set foot in those houses. I was not allowed to drink from the same cups. I was not allowed to sit on the same bench. Now, this was very important when I came to Kansas, because the very first time I went to Sunday school, I learned a new thing. You see, if you don't know the geography of Kansas, you would know that Hill City is about an hour and a half west of here. Now, our farm was 10 miles east of Hill City. And if you go just another 10 miles east from our farm, you would come to Nicodemus, Kansas. And if you don't know what Nicodemus, Kansas is, Nicodemus is one of the oldest and the longest standing black settlements in Kansas. So the first time I went to Sunday school, the teacher took me downstairs and sat me down next to a little colored girl. Now, forgive me, I'm just giving you an example of how strange it was for me when I came to Kansas. She sat me down next to that little girl, and I just stood right back up. They pushed me down again, and I stood right back up. Well, we just kind of went back and forth for a little while, and I was getting a little bit heated. So the pastor overheard us, and he came downstairs, and he looked at the teacher, and he said, "What in the world are you trying to get her to sit down there next to that girl? Don't you know she just got off the train from Kentucky? That's not going to happen." So I struggled in Kansas. There were no blackberries, no walnuts, people talked funny, and it was a real struggle. I'm going to tell you a funny story. This is an embarrassing story, very embarrassing. As I was going to school, I saw what I thought were hazelnuts laying all over the ground. Hazelnuts everywhere. I was so excited because I love hazelnuts. So I scooped up a whole bunch of them and I put them in my apron. Sorry, I am falling here. And I scooped them up into my apron, and I went home and I sat on my porch. I got a big rock, and I started to smash those. I was trying to break those hazelnuts. And every time I'd take my rock and I'd try to smash it, they'd just squish and squish. I was getting frustrated. Well, Grandma heard me out on the porch, and she came out and she said, "What in tarnation are you doing out here?" I said, "Grandma, I found all these hazelnuts, but they're rotten. All of them, they're rotten." Well, Grandma, she knew what was what, and she came out and she said, "Darling, them ain't hazelnuts, them's rabbit pellets." Well, she whipped me up so fast and took me in the bathroom and scrubbed about 3 layers of skin off my hands. In the meantime, my dad and my father were sitting in their chairs. Well, they were no longer sitting in their chairs because they were laughing so hard they plumb fell out of their chairs. So needless to say, I did not like Kansas, not one bit, when I first moved here. But I have to tell you, as I grew up and I lived in high school, I grew to love the open vastness of Kansas. I began to love how the sun shined down on you. You don't get that in Kentucky. There's too many trees everywhere. But not only did I grow to love the openness of Kansas, I also grew to love the open-mindedness of Kansas. And so I became a teacher. And I stayed in Hill City working as a teacher, and eventually became the editor of the Hill City Times. So my first husband, after I graduated high school, I don't like to talk about him much. He obviously didn't get the good Kansas whoopings that I did. That makes him more open-minded. So I married a second time after I had my 2 daughters, and my second husband was a dream, very supportive in whatever I wanted to do. And what I wanted to do was fly. Now, by this time, I was already 46 years old, and I was a grandma. I had 2 grandbabies, but that wasn't going to stop me. When I first told my family that I wanted to fly, they thought Grandma has lost whatever sense she had left. But I tell you, if you want to find out what your family and your community, you want to find out what people think about you, just go out, spend a bunch of money on a big piece of machinery that you have no idea how to use, and put it in your front yard. You'll have people coming out of the woodworks. Some of them will just shake their head in disbelief. Some of them will just kind of laugh. But the most interesting ones was every once in a while we'd have someone say, "Hey, did I read in the paper that you bought an airplane?" And I'd say, "Well, yes, I did." And they say, "Good. Well, I don't feel so bad about buying that motor scooter now." Now, this was 1955 when I finally started to take my flight, or wanting to take my flight lessons. But things were very different in 1955. The average woman was usually a stay-at-home wife or worked as a teacher or as a nurse. Now, I had a trouble because I could not find a flight instructor. Nobody in Hill City or Plainville wanted to take little old me up in an airplane. But just as I had married a dream of a husband, one of my daughters had also married a dream of a husband. And so my son-in-law, Andy, decided that he would volunteer and he would take flight lessons, hoping that whoever would teach him would just go ahead and teach me too. And we found him. His name was Mike Waltz. His name was Jerry Waltz, and he called us Double Trouble. So there's a lot of things to learn about flying. Now, the first thing that I had to learn, the first lesson, was to learn about patterns. Now, those of you ladies in the room, you know how we make patterns. We measure someone. We make it smaller for someone thinner. We make it a little bigger for someone plumper. And we make clothing. Well, I was supposed to fit a pattern to the wind, not fit the pattern to a person. And as you can see today is a perfect example. Kansas's wind is a bit too unpredictable for me to get an accurate pattern. Didn't work. The second thing that I learned was you want to find the runway before the runway finds you. We had a lot of practice on that. Another thing that we had to learn was you have to practice stalling. You have to practice what would you do if your engine cuts out in the middle of the air. But what you're supposed to do is practice that stall in a couple thousand feet up in the air. And I found out that you shouldn't do it at 400 feet. It just doesn't work very well. You have a very bumpy landing. One of our final lessons that we learned, now so far at this point, we figured that our instructor wasn't suicidal, but we could not understand why he had the annoying habit of cutting off the switch when we were over completely unlandable land. I swear, every farm has terraces, and I think the farmers are out to get me because they've been putting up fences every mile trying to get rid of all my emergency landing places. Now, it's very important to mention another thing about Kansas during this time. Kansas was very integral to the aviation history. We're known as the aviation capital of the world. A lot of people came to Kansas to fly because of the wide open spaces. People came from all over the world to not only to practice flying, but also to see about the new aviation and the new airplanes that were coming about, the new landing systems that were coming out. But the most exciting people that came to Kansas, and they actually came to Hill City, were the 99s. For those of you who don't know who the 99s are, it was a group of female pilots that were founded in 1928 by none other than Amelia Earhart. The 99s came to Hill City, and I was so excited to meet them and even more excited to impress them. But I didn't. In fact, one of them said that if I would have been flying anything other than an coupe, that they'd have been picking me up in a basket. A few others said that they got a few gray hairs from watching me fly. A lot of them were a little bit younger than me. But when you're thinking about the 99s and the female pilots and the women who were out every day, like me, I was flying around getting stories from the Hill City Times. But if Mama is out flying around in an airplane, somebody's got to stay home with the kids, right? So I almost like to say that the 99s helped to bring about the founding of the stay-at-home dad. Because there were a group of men who were married to the 99s, and they decided to create a support group for themselves. They had to feed the children, they had to change diapers, and they decided that they were going to start a new group called the 49 and a halfers. Them being the lesser halves of their better 99s counterparts. Now, these 49 and a halfers even had their own award. It was a milk bottle with wings affixed to the front. And this award was given to the poor man who had to stay at home for the longest period of time. They still do that today. I got my license, and I have enjoyed flying all over the place, learning and writing up stories about all the different things happening in Kansas. But the most important thing that I want to share with you today is that you are never too old to follow your dreams. Thank you.
Dodge City, 1884. Still home to Bat Masterson, killer of 32 men. Saloons, gambling halls, gunfights, all of the things that made Dodge a city of legend. And yet, it was drifting perilously close to the shores of respectability. The Eastern press had begun commenting on the pacifism present in Dodge and talked about the town as a rough place with good people, a dynamic business community, and a place safer to walk around than Kansas City or Chicago. They even said it wasn't the town it used to be. Fewer dance halls, no open gambling, and only a few saloons operating in the defiance of prohibition. This came from the McPherson paper and might have been slightly optimistic. Dodge hadn't reformed. It was just more conscious of its reputation. Why, only a few weeks earlier, the gamblers had placed the town under siege for a week. 2 years earlier, the town marshal was threatened with death. He barricaded himself in the town square and calmly picked off all of his opponents with his trusty Winchester whenever they ventured outside. As for prohibition, the saloon keepers took up a collection and sent it to the mayor with a note to be given to the widow of the first man who turns us in. My name is Alonzo B. Webster, formerly the mayor of Dodge City. It troubled my soul to see that wonderful, exciting reputation being turned into something calm and quiet. Things needed to be shaken up. With the 4th of July coming up, I had a great idea. We would stage a real Mexican bullfight in Dodge City. It would have real Mexican bullfighters and all of the tradition that goes along with it, including killing of the bulls. I spread the word among my business friends, and within a day had raised over $10,000 to defray the cost. There were many tasks to be performed in short order, and I was made general manager of the Dodge City Driving Park and Fair Association. We needed matadors, bulls, and an arena. Time was of the essence. Well, we wanted genuine Spanish bullfighters, and I knew just the man, a Scottish lawyer named Muir. Doesn't it make sense that a Scotsman would know bullfighters? Well, Muir had lived in Paso del Norte for 10 years and taught at a Mexican college. Even better, he came as the manager of the bullfighters and started dealing with all the ruckus immediately. What ruckus, you might ask? Well, nearly every newspaper from Kansas City east was howling about the barbarous exhibition about to be held. In addition, the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals out of New York City made a direct appeal to Kansas Governor Glick. Muir tried to assure everybody that it was an athletic exhibition, and the only weapons employed would be little darts to excite the bulls. The mayor of Dodge City received a telegram from the U.S. Attorney's Office stating that bullfighting was illegal in the U.S., to which the mayor responded, "Hell, Dodge City is not in the United States." As for the ASPCA's appeal to the governor, well, Governor Glick calmly waited to respond until 3 days after the fight was over, saying the bullfight was rather tame, of no importance to Dodge City, and I am your obedient servant. Good day. While all these words were flying about, I was one busy guy. We got the bulls from the Texas herds that were camped around the town, asking the owners for the meanest, nastiest bulls they could find. They were, after all, from Texas, and mean and nasty was expected. We ended up with 12 fine specimens who had all been named. Ringtail Snorter was the cream of the crop, joined by Iron Gall, Ku Klux, Sheriff, Rustler, Loco Jim, Eat 'em Up Richard, Cowboy Killer, Lone Star, Long Branch, Opera, and Doc. The Cowboys had respect for their bulls, and the names helped with the wagering that would take place as to how many matadors each bull would kill or maim. The matadors arrived, and Muir had done himself proud. These 5 experienced Mexican bullfighters helped raise the excitement to a fever pitch. Much was made of their professionalism, dedication, fatalistic attitude toward death, and the fact that none of them drank hard liquor. This was all part of Muir's strategy to give this event a tone of respectability, not savagery. On the morning of the 4th, any concerns about whether the event would be a success or not were put to rest. Many people had arrived from the east, thanks to the Santa Fe Railroad. Mixed into the throngs were cowboys from all over the Southwest, armed and spurred, money in their pockets, and 2 days to spend it. The dance halls were booming, the gambling halls were bustling, and the saloons were full to the brim. Correspondents from every major newspaper were also in attendance. There was a grand parade to the arena about noon, made up of dignitaries and the matadors. The matadors were the hit, dressed in red jackets, blue tunics, white stockings, and small dainty slippers, and were heartily applauded by the crowd. The arena we built held 4,000 people with an 8-foot fence to keep the bulls out of the crowd. At least a third of the crowd were women and children. Since some of the town's women had reputations, a deputy sheriff was assigned to seat them separately from the more genteel ladies. I don't remember who that frontier St. Peter was, but I'm sure some of his decisions were questioned loudly. Opposite the dignitaries and the families were the cowboys and their ladies. One writer reported that it seemed the ambition of every cowpuncher was to get a large woman and a high seat at the same time. The first bull bounded into the arena, a red, fierce-looking brute, and proceeded to give the matadors all they could handle. He fought for 30 minutes until the cheering crowd asked him to be returned to the pen, having performed so impressively. The second bull was brought out and promptly ran from the matadors. The third was no better, and the fourth also did poorly. The fifth did even worse than his predecessors. He got tangled up in the gate. It had been announced that the last bull of the day would be dispatched by the chief matador, and the crowd began shouting for the first bull to be returned to the ring. The red bull was turned back in, and the final contest began. He managed to knock the matador down at least once, but in the end, the inevitable happened, and he was killed. So ended the first day. According to the Ford County newspaper, the second day was more interesting and noted that this was the first fight on American soil. Everyone came away knowing that they had seen an authentic bullfight. It was difficult to get the opinions of the cowboys in attendance, but according to the Larned newspaper, quite a number of our boys visited Dodge last week to see the bullfight. Some of them returned looking as though they had had a personal encounter with the animals. Dodge City's frontier wild town reputation was intact for a few more years, and I, Alonzo B. Webster, had accomplished my goal. Alonzo Webster was born in Pembroke, New York in 1845. Following the Civil War, he went west in search of wealth and settled in Hays, Kansas. He soon earned a reputation as a distinguished character against the lawless element of the town. When confronted in his dry goods store by a gang of ruffians and told to leave town, he shot the leader dead. Alonzo and his family moved to Dodge City in 1872, where he formed a partnership with O.A. Bond and opened the Stock Exchange Saloon, and when Prohibition began, opened Palace Drug. He was first elected mayor in 1881, and the word went out that Dodge had a mayor who knew how to use a sawed-off shotgun and was proficient with a pistol. At that time, Bat Masterson and his gang were running the town pretty much as they pleased, and it took a confrontation on Main Street with Alonzo facing down Bat with his shotgun to change that. I believe the words exchanged were, "Throw up your hands or you're a dead man." Alonzo was eventually elected to 4 terms as mayor of his beloved Dodge City. Unfortunately, he suffered severely from rheumatism, and shortly after being elected to office in 1887, died at the age of 42. His funeral and procession were like no other in Dodge City, and he lies at rest today in Boot Hill next to his best friend, O.A. Bond, who died in 1927. As for the future of bullfighting, the howl of the press over the fights was enough to chill any thoughts of more exhibitions. Several mock bullfights were held without real matadors, and Cripple Creek, Colorado, held a fight using Hereford bulls. That was not a pretty sight. Thank you very much.
In history and in the 1800s, women weren't treated particularly well. You couldn't have a career. You could be a teacher, but there was restrictions on that. You couldn't be married. You could be a domestic worker, a secretary, and that's about the only jobs you could have. That was until you got married, which you were expected to do, and then you were expected to be a wife and a mother. Higher education for women produces monstrous brains and puny bodies, abnormally active cerebellum and abnormally weak digestion, flowing thought, and constipated bowel. This was written by E.H. Clarke in his book, Sex Education for a Fair Chance for Girls. Male doctors publicly chastised women who wanted to enter the medical field as being unnatural and lacking an ability to know their place. Male students at Harvard University in 1850 drafted a protest. Resolved, no woman of true delicacy would willingly, in the presence of men, listen to discussions of subjects that necessarily come under the consideration of medicine. Resolved, the company of any female forced upon us who is disposed to unsex herself and to sacrifice her modesty by appearing with men in medical lecture room. As you see, women were not accepted by society either as fit physicians, and medical schools refused to accept them. Let me introduce myself. I'm Arabetha Anna Correll Thompson. I was born January 3rd, 1850, to Christopher and Rebecca Coel in Monroe County, Pennsylvania. In 1851, my family moved to Rock Creek Township in Illinois. There, my sister Lucy was born on November 11th, 1851. By 1870, our family was living in Elk Grove Township in Illinois. Lucy and I attended Mount Carroll Seminary, which was later Shimer College. Well, Lucy and I both got accepted to Hammersman's College Medical College in Illinois. From there, we graduated with homeopathic medicine. Now, this was one of the few medical colleges that would accept women. They opened in 1860 and became coeducational in 1871. Now, for those of you who don't know what homeopathic medicine is, it is a practice of medicine that embraces holistic and the natural way to treat the sick. They treat a person a whole rather than just the disease part or a labeled sickness. Except for that emphasis, our training was the same as every other medical school in the area, in the United States. My sister and I graduated with the highest honors. Well, we first opened our practice over a furniture store in Sterling, Illinois. On November 17th, 1873, my sister married Mayo Thompson, and they moved to Iowa. Meanwhile, I was getting to know Mayo's brother, Curtis. We met at their wedding. We were married on August 18th, 1876 in Pennsylvania. A year later, we moved to Fairfield, Iowa, and there the first of our two children, Louis William and Sarah Pauline, were born. In 1879, we moved to Red Neck, Iowa, and I opened my practice, and Curtis operated a creamery. There, our son, Raymond Harmon, was born. Well, as the West opened up, there were very few doctors out here. So women thought, hey, I could go out there and they'll accept me because I'll be all they have. Well, that wasn't necessarily so, because people's idea of women doctors stayed the same, and they were prejudiced against us. In 1879, Mayo and Lucy bought a partially proven homestead in Section 35 of Independence Township, Osborne County, Kansas. That's somewhat 11 miles southwest of Osborne. Lucy opened a practice. Her practice really consisted of, if a doctor had to take off for a while, she stepped in and took care of their patients. That was acceptable. In 1882, Curtis and I moved to Kansas, and we got the adjoining farm next to Mayo and Lucy. Our husbands pooled their land so they could form a large ranch. And Lucy and I resumed our practice via buggy and horse. Things were really going fine until August of 1883, and Lucy was taking care of a patient who had pneumonia. She contracted the pneumonia and died later that year. She left 2 children and her husband, and was buried in Bristow County. We lived on the ranch for another 10 years, and Curtis devoted his time to raising livestock, and he was one of the first farmers who introduced alfalfa to this part of the country. Our 4th child, Austin Lee, was born October 1883. And then came Phoebe, Edward Wayne, Madison were born. Well, in the spring of 1892, we decided to move to town. We moved to Osborne so our children could have a better education. And I could open an urban practice. There was still prejudice. There was an article written that be careful who you go to. There are quacks out there, and they poison areas. So we were still somewhat prejudiced against. We continued to operate the ranch until 1805, and we sold it. In 1901, prior to the selling of the ranch, Curtis and I settled on a machine shop and a locksmith shop in Osborne. We operated